Grace Mitchell had been the perfect pastor's wife for 15 years. She smiled during services, she led the women's Bible study. She organized church potlucks and welcomed newcomers, and always stood supportively beside her husband as he preached to their congregation of over 1,000 people every Sunday. She wore modest dresses and kept her hair neat and her voice soft. She never disagreed with Pastor David publicly. She never caused drama or made scenes. She was exactly what a pastor's wife was supposed to be: supportive, submissive, silent. Behind closed doors, she was something else entirely. A woman documenting her husband's sins with the methodical precision of someone planning a reckoning. Now, on Christmas Eve, standing in the back of the packed sanctuary as Silent Night played and candles flickered and her husband prepared to deliver his annual beloved sermon, Grace felt the weight of the folder in her hands. Inside, printed text messages, bank statements, photographs, witness statements. 3 years of evidence proving that Pastor David Mitchell, beloved shepherd of Cornerstone Community Church, spiritual leader to thousands, man of God, was a fraud, a thief, and an adulterer. Tonight, in front of everyone, Grace was going to preach the sermon her husband should have preached years ago, the one about confession, accountability, and the truth setting you free, whether he wanted to be free or not. It had started 3 years ago with a feeling Grace couldn't quite name. David had been distant, distracted. He spent more time at the church, came home later, was always on his phone. When Grace asked if everything was okay, he'd smile that pastoral smile, warm, reassuring, slightly condescending, and say, "Just busy with ministry, honey. You know how it is." She did know. Ministry was demanding. The church had grown rapidly under David's leadership, from 200 members to over 1,000. They'd launched a building campaign for a new sanctuary. David was writing a book. He was in demand as a conference speaker. Of course he was busy. But something felt wrong. Grace started noticing small things, receipts that didn't make sense, unexplained absences. The way David's face changed when he got certain text messages, a look she hadn't seen in years, a look that used to be for her. Then, 6 months into her vague suspicions, Grace found the first concrete evidence. She'd been looking for their insurance card in David's car and found a receipt from a hotel, 2 hours away. 3 nights, charged to their credit card, during a week when David had supposedly been at a pastor's conference. Grace had called the conference. David Mitchell hadn't been registered. She'd checked the credit card statement more carefully. 4 hotel stays over 3 months, all charged while David was supposedly away for ministry. Her hands had shaken as she realized what this meant. But Grace didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, she started documenting. She created a secret email account. She started taking screenshots of credit card statements. She checked phone records and found hours of calls to one number, a number she eventually identified as belonging to Melissa Carter, the 28-year-old worship leader at their church. Melissa, young, beautiful, talented, always asking Pastor David for spiritual mentorship, always staying late after rehearsals to discuss ministry. Grace had thought nothing of it, had trusted her husband, had believed in his integrity. She'd been a fool, but she wasn't going to stay one. Over the next 2 years, Grace gathered evidence with the patience of someone who knew she'd only get one chance to be heard. Text messages recovered from phone backups. Explicit messages between David and Melissa. Plans for hotel meetings. Declarations of love. Promises that David would eventually leave Grace when the time was right. But the affair wasn't the only sin Grace discovered. While tracking their finances for evidence of hotel charges, Grace found discrepancies in the church building fund, the fund David managed, the fund that was supposed to be saving for their new sanctuary. Money was missing. Lots of money. Grace wasn't a forensic accountant, but she was smart and methodical. She cross-referenced bank statements, donation records, and church financial reports. She created spreadsheets. She documented patterns. Over 3 years, David had siphoned approximately $180,000 from the building fund into personal accounts. Small amounts at first, then larger. Always carefully hidden in legitimate-seeming transfers. Always covered with paperwork that looked official but didn't quite add up when examined closely. He'd been stealing from their church, from people who trusted him, from families who'd sacrificed to give toward a new building, believing their pastor was faithfully stewarding their donations. Grace felt sick, betrayed, furious. But she also felt something else, coldly, grimly determined. She kept documenting, kept playing the perfect pastor's wife, kept smiling on Sundays while her husband preached about integrity and faithfulness and living a life worthy of the calling. She watched him counsel couples on marriage while texting his mistress from the church office. She watched him preach about financial stewardship while embezzling from the building fund. She watched him lead worship about God's holiness while living a double life. And she planned. Christmas Eve was the biggest service of the year at Cornerstone Community Church. Over 1,000 people attended in person. Hundreds more watched the live stream. It was David's showcase sermon, his annual message that people talked about for weeks afterward. This year he was preaching The Gift of Grace, a sermon about God's unmerited favor, about forgiveness and second chances. The irony was almost too much. But it was also perfect. Because this Christmas Eve, Grace was going to give her husband a gift too, the gift of exposure, the gift of accountability, the gift of consequences. She'd consulted with a lawyer, quietly, secretly. She'd been assured that what she planned wasn't illegal, though it would be explosive. She'd backed up all her evidence in multiple locations. She'd prepared copies for the church board, for the congregation, for the authorities who would need to investigate the financial crimes. And she'd written her own sermon. Not a vengeful rant, not a bitter attack, a calm, factual presentation of truth, framed in the language her husband used every Sunday. Scripture-based, theologically sound, delivered with the same authority David claimed when he stood in that pulpit. Tonight, Grace Mitchell was going to preach. And her congregation was going to listen. The sanctuary was beautiful on Christmas Eve. Hundreds of candles flickered. The choir had sung O Holy Night beautifully. Families filled the pews, children restless with excitement, parents tired but happy. The live stream had over 500 viewers already. Grace sat in her usual spot in the front row, the pastor's wife's seat, where everyone could see her supportive presence. She wore a navy blue dress, simple and elegant. Her hands rested calmly on the folder in her lap. David stood to approach the pulpit, his Bible in hand, his pastoral smile in place. He looked confident, beloved, righteous. He looked like a man who had no idea his world was about to end. "Good evening, Cornerstone family," David began, his voice warm and welcoming. "What a blessing to see so many of you here tonight. And to those watching our live stream, welcome. We're so glad you've joined us for this special celebration of our Savior's birth." Murmurs of amen rippled through the congregation. "Tonight I want to talk about grace," David continued, "about God's incredible gift of unmerited favor, about how none of us deserve his love, yet he gives it freely, about second chances and new beginnings and—" "Excuse me." Grace stood up. Every head in the sanctuary turned toward her. David stopped mid-sentence, confusion flickering across his face. "Grace? Honey, I'm in the middle of—" "I know," Grace said, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "But tonight's sermon is going to be a little different. Tonight, I'm going to preach." The silence was absolute. David laughed, nervous, uncertain. "Sweetheart, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Grace interrupted. She walked toward the platform, folder in hand, her steps steady despite her racing heart. "You've had this pulpit for 15 years, David. Tonight, it's mine." She reached the steps leading to the platform. David moved to block her, his smile strained, his voice low and tight. "Grace, what are you doing? Sit down. We'll talk about this at home." "We won't," Grace said quietly, meeting his eyes, "because I'm done being silent. I'm done protecting your reputation while you destroy everything this church is supposed to stand for." She climbed the steps. David grabbed her arm, still trying to maintain his pastoral demeanor, but unable to hide the panic in his eyes. "You're embarrassing yourself." "No," Grace said, pulling her arm free. "I'm exposing you." She walked to the pulpit. The congregation sat in stunned silence. Some looked confused. Others looked uncomfortable. A few looked intrigued. Grace opened her folder, laid out her carefully prepared notes, and looked at the sea of faces staring at her. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady. "My name is Grace Mitchell. I've been a member of this church for 15 years. I've led your Bible studies. I've babysat your children. I've brought meals when you were sick and prayed with you during hard times. And for 15 years, I've stood beside this man as he preached to you about righteousness and integrity and living a life that honors God." She paused, letting her words settle. "Tonight I'm going to tell you the truth about the man you've entrusted with your spiritual leadership, and I'm going to use his own words, his own theology, to do it." David stood frozen at the side of the platform, his face pale, his pastoral mask finally slipping. Grace opened her Bible. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus warns about false prophets. She began. He says, "Beware of false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits." She looked up at the congregation. "Let me tell you about the fruits of your pastor's life." She pulled out the first document. 3 years ago, David began an affair with Melissa Carter, our worship leader. Gasps rippled through the sanctuary. Melissa, sitting in the worship team section, went white. "I have text messages," Grace continued calmly. "Explicit messages. Plans for hotel meetings. Declarations of love. Would you like to hear some of them?" "Grace, stop," David started forward. "I can't wait to feel your body against mine," Grace read from a printed text. "Being with you is the only time I feel truly alive. I'll find a way to leave Grace soon, I promise." The sanctuary erupted in shocked murmurs. David looked like he might be sick. Grace continued relentlessly. "Over the past 3 years, David has charged hotel rooms to our personal credit card. Hotel rooms where he met Melissa while telling this congregation he was attending ministry conferences. I have receipts, I have credit card statements, I have proof that our pastor has been living a double life." She pulled out more documents. But adultery isn't his only sin. She held up bank statements, her hands perfectly steady. "For 3 years, David has been embezzling money from the church building fund, the fund you've all sacrificed to contribute to. The fund that's supposed to be building our new sanctuary." The gasps were louder now. Board members in the front rows leaned forward, faces shocked. "I've documented approximately $180,000 in fraudulent transfers over 3 years," Grace said. Small amounts at first, larger as he got bolder. "All hidden in paperwork that looked legitimate but wasn't. All stolen from this church. From you." She showed the financial documents to the nearest board members, who took them with shaking hands. "Pastor David preaches about financial stewardship," Grace said, her voice carrying through the shocked silence. "He preaches about being faithful with what God has entrusted to us. Meanwhile, he's been stealing from the very people he's supposed to shepherd." David found his voice, defensive and desperate. "This is slander. These are lies." "They're not," Grace said calmly, "and you know they're not. I have 3 years of evidence. Bank statements, text messages, hotel receipts, witness statements from people who've seen you with Melissa. Financial records showing exactly where every dollar went. I've already provided copies to the church board and to legal authorities who will be investigating the embezzlement." She looked at her husband, really looked at him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. "You're a fraud, David, a hypocrite. You stand in this pulpit every Sunday and preach about holiness while living in deliberate, calculated sin. You counsel couples on faithfulness while having an affair. You teach about integrity while stealing. You speak for God while dishonoring everything he stands for." Tears streamed down faces throughout the congregation, some crying for the betrayal, others for the loss of innocence, still others simply in shock. Grace turned back to her Bible. "James chapter 3 says, 'Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness.' David, you chose to be a teacher. You chose to position yourself as a spiritual authority, and you will be judged accordingly." She closed her Bible, placed her hands on the pulpit where her husband had stood for 15 years, preaching half-truths while living lies. "I'm not doing this for revenge," Grace said quietly. "I'm doing this because silence protects abusers. Silence protects fraud. Silence protects men who use God's name to hide their sins. And I'm done being silent." She looked at Melissa, who was crying in the worship section. "Melissa, you're young enough to be our daughter. David used his position of spiritual authority to manipulate you. That's not love. That's abuse of power. And you deserve better than being someone's secret." She looked at the congregation. "And all of you, you've enabled this by making your pastor untouchable, by treating him like he's somehow above accountability, by believing that questioning leadership is the same as questioning God. It's not. David Mitchell is not God. He's a man, a flawed, sinful man who needs to face consequences for his actions." The silence in the sanctuary was profound. Grace gathered her documents. "The board has copies of everything. Legal authorities will be investigating the financial crimes. David will face appropriate consequences. And this church needs to decide what kind of community it wants to be, one that protects image over truth, or one that actually lives what it preaches." She stepped back from the pulpit. "Silent night, holy night," Grace said softly. "Not in this church, not anymore. The silence ends tonight." She walked down from the platform, past her husband who stood frozen and exposed, past the shocked congregation, and out the back doors of the sanctuary. Behind her, the church erupted in chaos. The aftermath was swift and devastating. The board called an emergency meeting that same night, still in their Christmas Eve clothes, faces grave. David was placed on immediate administrative leave. An independent investigation was launched into the financial irregularities. Within a week, the evidence Grace had provided, combined with additional documentation the board discovered once they started looking, confirmed everything. David had embezzled $183,000 over 3 years. He'd manipulated accounting records, falsified reports, and systematically stolen from people who trusted him. He was arrested on charges of embezzlement and fraud. The affair with Melissa was also confirmed, not just through Grace's evidence, but through additional witnesses who came forward once the silence was broken. Other women reported inappropriate behavior from David over the years. Boundaries crossed, power abused, all hidden behind his pastoral authority. Melissa resigned from the worship team and entered therapy. She'd been groomed, manipulated, made to believe the affair was somehow spiritual, somehow meant to be. Facing the truth was devastating, but necessary. David's book deal was canceled. His speaking engagements were pulled. His pastoral credentials were revoked. He pled guilty to the embezzlement charges to avoid trial and was sentenced to 4 years in prison with restitution requirements. His perfect image, carefully cultivated over 15 years, crumbled in a matter of weeks. Grace didn't attend church for a while after Christmas Eve. She needed space. Needed time to process 15 years of betrayal, to grieve the marriage she'd thought she had, to figure out who she was outside of being, quote, the pastor's wife. She filed for divorce. It was granted quickly, given the circumstances. The congregation was fractured. Some people blamed Grace for destroying the church by exposing David. Others rallied around her, finally seeing the truth about the man they'd placed on a pedestal. The church brought in interim leadership, therapists to help process the trauma, financial consultants to rebuild trust. Slowly, Cornerstone Community Church began to heal. Grace started attending a different church, smaller, quieter, where no one knew her story and she could just be another person in the pews. She found freedom in anonymity. She also found her voice. She started a blog about spiritual abuse, about what happens when religious authority is weaponized, about how silence protects perpetrators. Her story went viral. She was invited to speak at conferences, to consult with churches about creating accountability structures, to help other women who were trapped in similar situations. She became an advocate, not bitter, but clear-eyed, not vengeful, but uncompromising about truth. Her daughter, who'd watched her mother be diminished for years under the guise of submission, saw her mother reclaim her power and learned what strength really looked like. 1 year after that Christmas Eve, Grace was invited back to Cornerstone Community Church. The new pastor, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, with a doctorate in theology and a commitment to transparency, had asked Grace if she'd be willing to share her story as part of a healing service. Grace had hesitated. Going back to that sanctuary, to that pulpit, felt overwhelming. But she'd agreed. The church was different now. Smaller. Many people had left after the scandal. But those who remained were serious about rebuilding something real, something honest. Grace stood at the pulpit again, the same pulpit where she'd exposed her husband's sins a year ago. "I didn't want to be here tonight," she said honestly. "Coming back to this place brings back painful memories. But I'm here because healing requires facing what hurt us." She looked at the congregation, smaller than last year, but more authentic. "A year ago, I stood here and told you the truth about your pastor, about my husband. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it was also necessary, because silence was killing all of us. Me, you, this church, everything we claim to stand for." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Some of you have told me I destroyed this church, that I should have handled it privately, quietly, the way a good Christian wife should. That exposing sin publicly was un-Christ-like." Grace smiled sadly. "But Jesus exposed religious hypocrisy publicly all the time. He called out the Pharisees in front of crowds. He overturned tables in the temple. He refused to be silent about injustice, even when silence would have been easier, safer, more polite." She looked at the new pastor, Dr. Chen, who nodded encouragingly. "I'm not saying what I did was perfect. I'm not saying it wasn't painful. But I am saying it was necessary. Because churches that prioritize image over integrity, reputation over truth, the comfort of leaders over the safety of the vulnerable, those churches aren't worshiping God. They're worshiping an idol of respectability." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the smaller congregation. "This church is different now," Grace continued. "Smaller, but healthier, more honest, more committed to actual accountability, instead of just talking about it. That wouldn't have happened if the silence hadn't been broken." She gripped the pulpit, the same pulpit where David had preached lies for 15 years. "Silent night, holy night," Grace said softly. "That hymn is beautiful. But silence isn't always holy. Sometimes silence is complicity. Sometimes breaking the silence is the most sacred thing we can do." She stepped back from the pulpit. "Thank you for letting me speak. Thank you for doing the hard work of healing. And thank you for learning that accountability isn't the enemy of grace. It's the evidence of it." The congregation stood and applauded, not the polite golf clap of religious gatherings, but genuine, sustained applause. People were crying, hugging, finally releasing a year of grief and growth. Grace left the platform and was immediately surrounded by people, thanking her, apologizing for not believing her sooner, sharing their own stories of spiritual abuse they'd finally found the courage to name. Dr. Chen approached, smiling. "That was powerful. Thank you. Thank you for creating a space where truth can actually be spoken," Grace said. "It's what church should have always been," Dr. Chen replied. Grace drove home that night feeling lighter than she had in years. She'd lost a lot. Her marriage, her role, her comfortable identity as the perfect pastor's wife. Her ex-husband was in prison. Her life looked nothing like what she'd imagined 15 years ago. But she'd gained something more valuable, her voice, her integrity, her self-respect. She'd stopped protecting a lie and started living the truth. And if that made her the woman who destroyed a church, so be it. Better to destroy something false and build something real than to maintain a beautiful facade hiding rot. Grace pulled into her driveway, a small house she'd bought with her divorce settlement, modest but hers. No more pastor's wife expectations, no more performing. Just her life, lived honestly. She walked inside, made tea, and opened her laptop. Her blog had grown significantly over the year. She had messages from women all over the country, sometimes the world, who were trapped in similar situations, who were being gaslit by spiritual leaders, who were told that speaking up about abuse was divisive or unchristian. Grace responded to each message with the same essential truth: your voice matters. Your safety matters. Protecting abusers in the name of unity is not godly. It's complicity. Speak your truth, even when your voice shakes. especially when your voice shakes. She thought about that Christmas Eve a year ago, standing at the pulpit, hands steady, voice clear, finally saying everything she'd been silent about for so long. It had cost her everything, but it had also saved her. And in breaking the silence, she'd given permission to countless others to break theirs. Silent night? Holy night? No. Sometimes the most holy thing you can do is refuse to be silent. Sometimes the most sacred act is exposing lies in the name of truth. Sometimes the real sermon isn't the one preached from the pulpit. It's the one lived in the courage to speak when silence is expected. Grace Mitchell had preached that sermon on Christmas Eve, and she'd been preaching it ever since. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. Not with vengeance, but with truth. Not silently, but boldly. Because the gift of grace isn't about enabling sin. It's about having the courage to name it, confront it, and demand better. And that sermon, the one about truth and accountability and refusing to protect abusers, was the most important one Cornerstone Community Church had ever heard. Even if it hadn't come from their pastor. Especially because it hadn't come from their pastor. It had come from the woman they'd expected to stay silent. The woman who'd finally found her voice and refused to ever be silent again.